Hi everyone. Imagine a world where artificial intelligence can persuade you more effectively than any human. As organizations and governments enhance their marketing and propaganda abilities, the advent of superhuman persuasion will increase the scale of false and tailored messaging dramatically. We will be exposed more than ever to potential manipulation and deception. How will this surge of disinformation affect our decisions and our lives? Keep watching to learn more. This video has 3 parts: lessons from conmen, superhuman persuasion, and how disinformation affects us. And this video also has a new style, a new microphone, a new background, etc. I hope you like it. Part 1. Lessons from conmen. Throughout history, there have been confidence men and confidence women that take advantage of people, who tell a story that's not true, but that seems appealing and to gain people's confidence. In general, humans are not very good at detecting lies. A study from 2006 found that humans are only about 54% accurate at detecting lies. Some people are much better than others at it, of course, but in general, detecting lies tends to focus on discrepancies in behavior or discrepancies between emotional content and facial expressions, etc. Of course, there are people that are much better at lying than others, mostly because they can control those facial expressions and emotions very precisely. One example that you probably haven't heard of is Kevin Mitnick. He's one of the most famous old school hackers of all time, or actually, we would technically say he's a social engineer, a modern day confidence man. He could basically convince anyone to do anything because he could sound as sincere as he wanted, and he could really misdirect people's attention to where he wanted them to look. He was put on federal most wanted lists and ended up evading capture for more than 2 years before he was finally arrested in 1995. He spent several years in jail, and when he was released, he quickly turned to consulting, telling companies how to keep hackers out, essentially. And I didn't know this until I was doing the research for this video, but he actually passed away less than a year ago as well. I had the opportunity to see Kevin Mitnick in person one year at Defcon, which is the most famous hacker convention that happens every year in Las Vegas. Kevin Mitnick invited volunteers from the audience to come up to the stage, where he proceeded to physically remove every single item they were carrying, from phones to watches that were actually tied around their wrists to keys, even wedding rings. And he would do this by distracting the individual, making them look at something, touching them on the shoulder, pretending to trip, whatever was needed to direct their attention away from what he was actually doing. And yet he managed to do it in such a way that the audience could clearly see every time he removed some valuable watch or whatever from the person in question. There were also some demonstrations at that conference of phone fraud, where people would call up businesses and pretend to be somebody legitimate, like a contractor or a customer, and slowly receive more and more information, the original phishing, if you will, until they had enough information to actually make a request. If I remember correctly, the request they made was to call up a bookstore and get some hacker magazine to be put right at the front of the store. Typically in these public demonstrations, they cancel the request at the end, like, oh, never mind, actually, I didn't really mean it, or whatever. But this type of thing happens in real life all the time, I'm sure, and it's very easy for someone who has psychopathic tendencies or who can really direct the attention of an audience. Those were some examples of high quality phishing, right? Where a human is on the other end really trying to do their best to convince you of something. But these days, the phishing that we come across is usually in the form of spam. It can be very low quality and it can be hard to believe that anyone falls for it. But it only takes one person to fall for it for the phishing scheme to have been worthwhile for its creator. So this is highly relevant to a future where data is generated quite easily and where you have AI systems that can easily customize and tailor messages to huge swaths of people for very low cost. Those run-of-the-mill phishing scams might end up looking more like Kevin Mitnick trying to pick your pocket. There's actually quite a lot of deception in our world for adults just walking around. I was speaking with a viewer on my channel, actually, who works with people that have a particular psychological condition, and that psychological condition means that they trust anyone without question, which is a bit childlike, but normally if you're a child, you have parents looking out for you. In this case, these people were constantly getting phishing calls and scams and falling for every single one. For their own safety, they'd have to have a caretaker actually responsible for their money, and they'd have to put lots of restrictions in place. I'm assuming 2-factor authentication and that sort of thing. And that could be us. That could be every human, every adult, if confronted with really powerful persuasion and phishing techniques. Part 2. Superhuman persuasion. As we discussed, persuading humans isn't all that difficult because we're not very good at detecting lies and we're fairly trusting in general. And especially if you receive a tailored message, then it can be quite easy to fool you. But the really interesting question is not whether or not we can be persuaded, but rather what will the persuasion look like when you have a superhuman persuasive agent. There's strong evidence to believe that this is not very far away. In fact, Sam Altman believes that superhuman persuasion would arise before AGI, before artificial general intelligence, which itself might only be a few years away. So how would this work? Well, basically, we know that large language models are already prone to hallucinations. They'll make up facts if needed to support whatever they're writing. But you can actually encourage this behavior by asking the model to have no scruples, essentially saying, make up whatever you want if it helps you write a more convincing argument. And as we'll see, it turns out that this is highly effective. I'll talk about 3 studies in this section, and the first one used GPT-3 to generate propaganda. What they did was they took a bunch of articles on different topics that were true disinformation pieces created by foreign governments, and then they asked GPT-3 to create similar types of articles. Keep in mind that this is only GPT-3, right? Probably GPT-4 would be much more effective at this task. Then they had 8,000 human participants actually read all those articles and decide whether they were convinced by them. These articles were between about 700 and 2,000 characters long. So here's how the results looked. 24% of the participants agreed with the statement. That's a pretty low number, but keep in mind that these were real disinformation articles and probably expressed some pretty extreme opinions. However, after reading the articles, the percentage of people that agreed with the thesis statement went from 24% to 47%. In other words, these disinformation articles were pretty effective. They increased the belief in a sample of 8,000 humans that what they were saying was actually true. Interestingly, when the authors used GPT-3 to generate some completely made up disinformation articles based on the same thesis statements, the human participants went from 24% to 43% in terms of their agreement with the thesis. 43% isn't as high as 47%, but GPT-3 was also given some pretty vague instructions. The authors used a little bit of human intervention to basically reserve the right to exclude certain articles if they didn't actually say what the person doing the propaganda wanted them to say, which seems like a fairly realistic scenario. And by doing that, they were able to get the agreement up to 46%, which was not statistically different from the 47% of the human written original articles. So using GPT-3 to generate completely made up articles was basically just as persuasive as having foreign agents manually craft those messages themselves. So this dramatically reduces the time it takes to create actually effective propaganda. Not quite superhuman yet, but maybe close to human equivalent. The second paper I want to talk about is from Anthropic, and they used 4,000 people to analyze false information on 28 different topics. They intentionally chose these topics to be on less polarized issues, however. They found that all the different Anthropic models had steadily increasing abilities in terms of persuasion, and the most capable Anthropic model at the time, which was Claude 3 Opus, produces results that don't statistically differ from arguments written by humans. They also said that it was very difficult to actually measure persuasiveness, especially in real-world contexts, such as election interference, but it does seem like we're trending towards what Sam Altman predicted, that we would reach superhuman levels of persuasion before even reaching other AI milestones like AGI. The third study I want to talk about actually did demonstrate superhuman persuasiveness. The scenario here was LLMs engaged in a debate with humans, going back and forth, trying to convince the human of some particular perspective. This study was using GPT-4 instead of GPT-3, like one of the studies I mentioned earlier. And the first version of this study found that GPT-4 actually was more convincing than humans, but not by a statistically significant percentage. That's when the LLM is just told, okay, go ahead, convince this human of some topic. But they did something else very interesting in this experiment. They gave GPT-4 access to personal, like demographic information about the human that it was interacting with. In this scenario, the human was actually about 82% more likely to agree with GPT-4 than to agree with a human debater. That's a really huge difference. More than 80% more likely to agree with GPT-4 than with a human. This is just with basic access to demographic information. The demographic information included gender, age, ethnicity, education level, employment status, and lastly, political affiliation. That's not a lot of information to have, and I think it's comparable to what someone trying to meddle with an election would have access to. So with that amount of demographic information and access to GPT-4, you can already have access to superhuman levels of persuasion. And I think 2024 is supposed to be a year with tons of global elections, right? Including the US election. So I guess it will be interesting to see where we end up. Part 3, how disinformation affects us. The real problem with disinformation is that mere exposure to information affects us. Actually, if you want to think about how disinformation affects us, you can draw close parallels with how advertisement affects us. Advertisement just tries to use repeated exposure to some message, probably a humorous message, probably something a little unusual, to have that really stick in your mind so that when you're trying to make a purchasing decision, you'll think about that and it will influence you. The key part here is that humans remember humor pretty well. So if you're trying to make up a false message, then all you have to do is make it humorous, and that will cause a person's brain to prioritize remembering it over remembering other things. Given information of approximately equal provenance, like equal trustworthiness, someone's going to remember the message that is humorous. And if you're making something up and you're not really worrying about listing references, it's quite easy to make something humorous, or that plays into existing tropes, or that leverages the political consciousness of a particular demographic. In online disinformation, we also see a lot of confirmation bias, where a person actually keeps seeing information that they think is true, and that reinforces their belief that it is actually true. So this means that seeing the same disinformation over and over again, or different messages from different sources that have the same underlying theme, can have a really strong impact on someone. This impact actually comes in two flavors. It can cause conscious adjustment of someone's behavior, or it can also cause unconscious adjustment of someone's behavior. We already talked a fair bit about adjustment of someone's conscious behavior. For example, agreeing with or disagreeing with some controversial thesis. But unconscious adjustment is probably by far the most pernicious. There are studies dating way back from 2014 that social media platforms can manipulate the emotions of their users. That's much more widely known these days, I think, where a platform might try to invoke some sense of outrage or fear of missing out or other emotions, primarily negative emotions, that are going to keep you glued to your screen and glued to the platform. There's work from 2017 that discusses how social media platforms can hypernudge people towards certain perspectives and towards predictable behaviors. Basically, the idea is that you can nudge someone to do something by, for example, putting the healthy food closer to them and the unhealthy food across the room. That will kind of nudge them to start eating more healthily. But this paper calls what social media platforms do a hypernudge, because they just have such a huge decision tree, such a huge search space to explore when they're figuring out what types of content to show you. There was one more study that showed that less than 5 minutes of exposure to fake news was enough to modify the unconscious behavior of individuals. These were fake articles constructed to look like Facebook news stories, and in fact, the participants were actually told that the stories had come from Facebook. There's been some increased recognition that mere exposure to disinformation actually causes you to start believing it, and platforms like Twitter or X and YouTube are starting to do things like labeling content that's known to be false. But again, just labeling something is insufficient. Someone's brain will probably still remember it. Funnily enough, when I logged onto YouTube Studio as I was doing the research for this video, I got a message about labeling realistic altered content. It said, quote, "For enhanced transparency, will require disclosure in YouTube Studio if content is meaningfully altered or synthetic and seems real. This includes realistic sounds or visuals made with AI or other tools." So I guess gathering that data is a useful first step, but the platforms really need to do more in the future to actually exclude that from reaching the eyes of viewers. Another big way disinformation affects us is in terms of increased polarization. There's a well-known journalistic tendency to always include two sides of a story, some controversial issue. And that's all well and good to ensure some sense of balance and to appear impartial. But you can also get this false balance, what's colloquially called both sidesism, where even in the face of disinformation or simply false statements, media is reporting on those statements at approximately the same amount of detail, allocating the same amount of runtime to each perspective, making them seem like reasonable people could believe A or reasonable people could believe B. Again, that's good journalistic behavior, but it's not the right way to deal with disinformation. This increased polarization has really started to compromise people's feeling of societal safety, which used to be not exactly guaranteed, but a lot more prevalent. You see strong polarization, you see strong political divides, you see people not being convinced by facts, you see completely opposite perspectives, and you know that at least some of those have to be lies, but you can't really tell which. You can't even trust other citizens to the same level that you used to. Those are all the side effects of increased polarization. Another example of the effects of disinformation is concentration of power. This includes power of all kind, from political power to data power, predictive power. Let's talk about TikTok, for example. It operates very similarly to other social media companies. So why is the US government potentially trying to ban it or go after after it, primarily because it has a lot of power over US citizens. It can show them different types of disinformation. It can gather lots of information on those users and predict ads, or use that as the personalization for disinformation campaigns like we talked about earlier in this video, where we already have superhuman level accuracy by using GPT-4. But then again, maybe everything I just said is fake news. Overall, we need to develop better tools for verifying the authenticity of information. Having things like citations can really help, for example, and having more education for people about verifying sources and trusting information that they don't know the provenance of. But probably most importantly, as a society, we need to figure out how to not even show things that are disinformation. Just labeling something as disinformation but leaving it there for the public to see might seem like the best approach in terms of maintaining transparency. But on the whole, that message is still going to impact people. So we need to figure out ways of dealing with that, because we're about to have a flood of disinformation. LLMs are at human level accuracy in terms of creating persuasive content, and arguably they're already straying into superhuman levels of performance. So if there's anyone out there looking for a good research topic or a good policy direction to look into, I think this would certainly qualify. Finally, in conclusion, we talked about some of the techniques that people use to try to deceive one another, how con men and confidence women can really gain your trust and get you to do something that's not in your interest. We feel like phishing and spam are really low quality levels of communication right now, but I think that's about to change. LLMs are reaching superhuman levels of persuasion, as demonstrated by studies already in GPT-4, provided you have some basic demographic information about the recipient of the information. And disinformation affects us all very strongly, consciously and unconsciously, the same way that advertisement does, and the reason that all companies invest into advertisement. The mere exposure to information is enough to have it start worming its way into our brain, and then other factors such as how humorous it is or how well it fits with our worldview are going to dictate whether we remember that and whether we allow it to influence our decisions. We're on the cusp of having a lot more false information customized for very specific viewers, and as a society, we don't really have good ways of dealing with that right now. Just labeling it alone as potentially suspicious or unverified or something like that is insufficient, because, as I mentioned, simply seeing the information can be enough to influence someone. If you liked this video, please check out this previous one I made about social media and how AI can shape our worldview. It's very similar to the one you just watched, although more of an analysis of the current state of affairs rather than the potential future. All right, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.